The aviation sector is not exactly the most competitive sector in the world. Basically, two companies dominate the market: Boeing and Airbus. Two heavyweights, two giants that control more than 90% of all aircraft sales worldwide. We're talking about a sector that is also rapidly expanding. As you can see in this chart, over the next 20 years, the number of air passengers is expected to grow at a rate of about 5% every year. And between this growth and the need to replace old fleets, the forecasts suggest that over the next 2 decades, at least 39,000 new aircraft will be required. It's a huge demand that will largely come from developing countries. And don't forget what we already told you in a previous video that I'll link to in the description. The aviation sector of the future is going to change a lot in the coming years. Many of the so-called dense routes based on gigantic hubs will be replaced by new thinner routes, i.e. direct routes with longer flights operated by smaller aircraft. And that shift, together with increasingly demanding environmental regulations, explains why Airbus and Boeing are in the process of adapting to these new paradigms. But let's not get distracted. The fact is that a lot of this promising future is particularly centered in Asia. And I'm not only referring to China, but also to other interested parties who are already making a strong impression. Look at this.
Even the sweepers can afford to fly. India opens 34 airports in 18 months as aviation market booms. The Washington Post.
But here's the question: what does this all really mean? Well, given the juicy growth forecasts in the aviation sector, the increasing importance of smaller aircraft, and the emergence of China as a technological and economic power, we're now starting to see some companies that want to become the new players in the aeronautical industry. That is, there are relevant manufacturers making a bid to compete with the larger ones. The question is, will they manage to achieve this, or will it just be yet another frustrated attempt? In this video, we're going to tell you about what's new in the world of aviation, so listen up. In the aviation sector, we find two important pieces of news. On the one hand, China's emergence in the aeronautical industry, and on the other, the demise of former regional aircraft manufacturers. But let me start at the end this time and tell you what happened to Bombardier and Embraer, the world's two largest small commercial aircraft manufacturers. Well, the facts. Canada's Bombardier, with its CRJ series, has built more than 1,800 aircraft, and Brazil's Embraer even more, about 2,700. In this way, between the two companies, they have controlled most of the regional aircraft market in the world. In recent years, however, it has not been easy for them. During this period, both Bombardier and Embraer have had serious difficulties reinventing themselves, adapting to a mature and very different market than existed when these companies first began to exploit their business. That is, their planes simply stopped selling well, and the companies were financially hamstrung as they made titanic efforts to keep up to date. We'll see the reason for this later, but for now, let's just stick with our story. The blow was especially hard for Bombardier, which saw its star program, the CRJ series that came into operation in the 1990s, ending in collapse with losses of approximately $600 million. In 2018, Brazil's Embraer also began losing money, about $180 million in that year alone. And of course, these financial blows, coupled with increasing pressure from Airbus and Boeing to control the regional aviation segment and thus get rid of the few competitors still standing, created the ideal scenario for the big fish to gobble up the small ones. Airbus made the first move by announcing the purchase of the C-Series program, the latest aircraft model developed by Canada's Bombardier, and soon after that, Boeing announced its merger with Brazil's Embraer, a merger, or rather a purchase, that is set to be completed this year, 2020.
Airbus has taken over and renamed the Canadian jet that Boeing tried to keep out of the US, Business Insider. Embraer soars in Sao Paulo as Bolsonaro approves Boeing deal. Bloomberg.
Now, did you think that the changes in the aviation sector would end here? Well, no, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, this was just the beginning. Any idea where the main action will be taking place? Exactly. I'm sure many of you have already guessed it. It's of course China. Ah, China, with their fingers in just about every pie. But it's not just about the big Asian giant, it's also about its neighbor, Japan, who is making a bid. However, these two cases represent two models and two ways, very different ways of doing things. You see, on the one hand, we have the Chinese state-owned manufacturer COMAC, which is trying to compete directly with Airbus and Boeing in the short and medium-haul aircraft market. This is a really consolidated market where trying to compete is a challenge that takes real entrepreneurial boldness. And on the other hand, we have Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one wing of the former Mitsubishi empire that today is engaged in the construction of ships, aircraft, and large industrial assemblies such as nuclear reactors. But hold on just a minute. Is it realistic that these companies start competing from scratch in 2020? Do they really have enough capacity to develop aircraft capable of competing with the fleets of two aviation giants? Because at the end of the day, if Boeing is having so many difficulties with its jinxed 737 MAX project, a subject which we covered in a previous video, imagine how much more complicated it must be to start practically from scratch. And the best example is probably the case of China's COMAC. You want to know how things are going for the Chinese and what we can expect from this risky venture? Well, listen to this.
COMAC, bogged down by its own ambition?
If there's one hazard that's common to any business venture, it's that sometimes aiming too high can mean shooting yourself in the foot before you've even begun. And this is precisely what might be happening to COMAC. Let me explain. To date, the Chinese state manufacturer has introduced two different aircraft models, the ARJ-21 and the C919. The first of these, COMAC's ARJ-21, is a 90-seat plane intended for regional routes. After a decade of delays in commissioning and 6 years between the first test flight and its eventual entry into the market, the ARJ-21 is already crossing the skies with some Chinese airlines. In fact, there are just over 20 planes currently in service. The problem is that with so many delays and such slow development, the plane is already outdated. This is why the United States and European markets consider it far, far more inferior to the regional aircraft made by Bombardier and Embraer. And it's a similar story with the latest and largest model, the C919, a medium-haul aircraft with a capacity for almost 170 passengers, which intends to compete directly against the current kings of the skies, the Boeing 737 series and Airbus's A320. However, the reality is that it seems an almost impossible mission for this aircraft to even get certified by aviation safety agencies such as the United States' FAA or the European EASA. Of course, this is a fundamental requirement for the craft to be able to fly in both of those regions. Designing, developing, and manufacturing airplanes is one of the most complicated tasks anywhere. It takes an average of 5 years for Boeing and Airbus's new models to be certified by aviation security agencies, so imagine what the time frame might be for a Chinese model manufactured by a company with no track record or established reputation. Today, the C919 is in a very difficult position, as it may never be certified by either the United States or Europe, and that's the reality of it. In other words, faced with this situation, one thing seems certain. Chinese manufacturer COMAC has a chance to get ahead and compete against Boeing and Airbus, but only in China, and perhaps with a bit of luck in an Asian or African country. In other words, globally, American and European manufacturers will be able to sleep peacefully at night, at least for a few years. So now let's switch to Japan to see what is happening with Mitsubishi's greatest aviation adventure, which we mentioned at the very beginning of this video. Well, by all appearances, the Japanese have opted for a much safer way forward with fewer hurdles.
Japan's return to the aviation race.
If Mitsubishi is highlighting anything in its drive to enter the aviation market fully, it is to be much more prudent and maybe smarter too. And as you'll see, in Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' aeronautical division, they don't mess around with small change. In addition to spending a whopping $7 billion developing their own models, the SpaceJet series, they've also splashed out by buying Bombardier's iconic CRJ program, which we were talking about at the beginning of the video. Everything's probably making a bit more sense now, right? While Airbus purchased the C-Series program, Mitsubishi saw an opportunity in Bombardier's CRJ program and secured it for $550 million. In this way, Bombardier, one of Canada's largest industrial groups, has completely unloaded its commercial aircraft business, which was a real money-losing machine. Meanwhile, Mitsubishi achieves a dual goal. On one hand, it will be in charge of maintaining the hundreds of CRJs flying around the world, and on the other, it manages to position itself as the natural substitute for these aircraft when companies need to renew their fleets. And that is precisely how the Japanese company hopes to introduce its SpaceJet series worldwide. This series is already in its final development phase after having made nearly 900 modifications to suit the requirements of the United States' FAA. Take note of this very important detail. Mitsubishi has prepared two versions of this model. One, the main one, for 88 passengers, and another, a little smaller, for 76. And this is not a trivial move. In fact, it's a decision that makes a great deal of sense. But why? Why on earth is the small version so important? Well, once again, it goes back to regulations and limitations that are difficult to understand, usually because they are the result of political negotiations where public interest is in the background. And as you'll see, in order to make sense of these rules, we have to know a couple of things. First, that US law prohibits foreign carriers from operating domestic flights on its territory. That is, the US aviation market is protected and reserved exclusively for US carriers. And secondly, of course, this ban also includes regional flights. And how is a regional flight defined? Well, it's a flight connecting one of the major airports, the really important ones, such as New York's JFK, the George Bush Airport in Houston, or Los Angeles International Airport, with other small airports. That is, with small airports that do not have much passenger demand and are operated by small aircraft. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these regional local airports throughout the United States. And the thing is, these regional flights are usually operated by subsidiaries and franchises of major airlines such as American Airlines or United. Why? Because these subsidiaries are not subject to the same labor agreements that affect large ones. That is, they have different working conditions and lower wages. And it is precisely for this reason, to prevent large airlines from outsourcing too many routes and traffic, that the trade unions agreed with the major airlines that the routes operated by these subsidiaries can only be operated with aircraft with a maximum of 76 seats and 86,000 pounds of weight. In other words, smaller planes than the ones that the current market conditions would need. Thus, if the big airlines want to use larger aircraft with more than 76 passengers, they have to operate the routes directly by themselves. So, trade unions protect the jobs of employees in these large companies, which, as we have already told you, are subject to more generous labor agreements. And yes, we're talking about the United States, not Argentina here. You see that things can be complicated everywhere. The fact is that it was for this reason that Mitsubishi continued it vital to take over the CRJ program, as well as to develop a smaller and even lighter version of its original aircraft. Pretty clever, wouldn't you think? In fact, this is what has allowed Mitsubishi to secure its first confirmed orders from US companies, specifically 160 aircraft. And if we add the other orders from Japan and other countries, the model seems to be popular despite having been developed by a company that has never built a commercial aircraft on its own before. But it's not quite that simple. The launch hasn't been without problems. It is actually riddled with delays. To give you an idea, initially the Japanese company intended to put the plane into service in 2013, but with all the design modifications it has had to make to obtain FAA certification, the delays have been ongoing and prolonged. Moreover, the slowness of Japan's own air safety agency, JCAB, to certify the model is not helping them meet the deadlines. As it stands today, the entry into service is now slated for 2021, following the latest delay announcement at the end of 2019. All of this has increased the cost of developing the SpaceJet program from $5.5 billion to more than $7 billion. Like I said, developing an airplane from scratch is neither cheap, nor fast, nor straightforward. Now, armed with all of this information, what do you think? Is the Boeing-Airbus duopoly under threat? Is the arrival of new competitors feasible in the future, given how complicated it is to develop a commercial aircraft? Can COMAC be an alternative to traditional manufacturers in China and other parts of the world? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, and as always, thank you for watching.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.